Now that we know how to get applications in there, how does the world of security relate to Entra ID? And we want to talk a little bit about that. Now, this next slide, people, gets Nick really excited because it's from his favorite playbook called Microsoft Cybersecurity Reference Architecture.
It's true.
And his name is also up in lights on one of the slides, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So when you actually look at not only MCRA, but zero trust architecture in the world of the Microsoft Cybersecurity Reference Architecture. Nick, do you want to talk to this and why there's some flashing lights on the screen?
I'd love to talk to the throbbing square on the left, yes. Now you'll notice there's identities and endpoints, both of which are just different types of identities. However, everything that's on the right-hand side of it is super interesting, but not today, because when we talk about zero trust, once we have a handle on identities and endpoints, and I might have made this point before, we buy ourselves time to secure the stuff on the right-hand side. Now, from an identities point of view, you can see that what's in the box, as long as we're licensed for it, is we've got identity protection, workload identification, Entra ID governance, Defender for identity, which sounds like it should be enough to protect us, except we have this no man's land, which Al has been alluding to around, well, if I create an identity and associate an application to it, or vice versa, where is that covered on this slide? And Al, is it covered on this slide?
Yes and no, right? But we need to understand the type of applications, not just how you get those applications into your environment, to understand how you can secure it, right? So moving on from these are the applications or the ways to get it in, why it's important that you need to worry about it, where ASPM fits in. It's also important to understand what the identity platform, at least contextualize the identity platform into your application platform, right? Which kind of sits inside of Entra ID. So these are the type of applications, and it's a nice guide. You can actually have a look at it at aka.ms/identity platform checklist. So if you are wanting to deploy applications to Entra ID, these are the types of applications that Entra ID supports, right? And you will notice that from left to right, well, it doesn't really matter, even though they chose the red color for the least secure type of application in your environment.
Red means
And
bad.
red does mean bad. Now, there are means and ways, and I'm going to talk about means and ways to secure a single page application, typically around, and this is specific to Teams apps, right? Or any sort of, you want to deploy a website into Azure, and it's literally a single page HTML bootstrapped with a bit of CSS, right?
So
And how
Al,
you would, yeah?
before you tell the people how to fix it, why don't we tell the people the horror show that is door number one and why it is a bad idea to do door number one, even though we can fix it? Why is it a bad idea?
You know, the PTSD part that you are bringing up inside of my mind right now. We worked with a team building an application for Teams, right? And the dev team was cloud native. They've never worked with Teams applications, downloaded the Teams toolkit. Now, Andrew Connell actually will tell you how to secure this specific process, but they were new to Teams, built an app. What it actually did from a Teams toolkit perspective, they published it to a storage account in Azure, and it was a single page application. Now, and I'm sure we've spoken about this on a previous webinar, when you create an SPA, right, inside of, you go to app registration, you say create SPA, right? You have Windows, not Windows, on that screen, it actually pops up and it says, hey, you need to, not you need to, you can, maybe you want to, maybe you don't want to, fill in specific information to secure that environment. Now, I'm not going to talk about a web app or the API stuff because those are confidential apps and they're more secure than a public app. And there's a blog post around public client flows and what you need to know. But when we look at the application considerations for these things, specifically around a single page application, something like a redirect URI, where you can actually prompt and force auth, login.onmicrosoft.com, you add that to the redirect URI, and your users are going to be forced to log in to access said application. You know, stuff like access tokens. Hey?
That's what you said. You can. You don't have to, and it's not mandatory. And
It's not
so as long
mandatory.
as we are all on the same page, we are effectively publishing a web page in Teams without authentication, aren't we?
Correct. That application, because what it does is it wraps it up into a Teams app, and it's going to surface. Now, single page applications, still the recommended approach to building a Teams app, because you've got greater control of what you're sticking inside of it. You can make it look and feel and smell and touch the way you want to, but you need to understand what implicit flows are. A simple concept as a redirect URI will force, even if an attacker got the URL, because it's literally just a URL to that page that's now surfaced inside of Teams, even if they got that URL, they will still be forced to authenticate. Now, you can build single sign-on into your Teams app. It's part of the toolkit. It's seamless, but you need to force that auth on the application that you're building. Otherwise, that URL can be put into a browser and it's going to open up that page without having a redirect URI in there. You know, some other things like certificates and secrets, I kept it separate. That's part of managed identities and a few other things in service principles, right? But it's not explicit or implicit for you to fill that details into a single page application. So understand when people give you applications, or your dev team, or you want to deploy an application to Entra ID, if it's an SPA, know that you need to do additional things. And that previous slide walks you through the things that you need to do from a security perspective to make sure that your application is secured. Make sense?
Makes sense
Cool.
to me.
All right, so we've got the why, we've got the what. We've spoken about how these things end up, what security looks like for these applications in your environment, and what you need to care about. The important part is you've got these things floating inside of your environment. What do you do now? Right? I mean, that's the important part. Unless you're literally spinning up a tenant today and you're going to 27 vendors and you're buying applications, and you've got a development team that's writing 17 other applications that they are going to deploy over the next year into your environment, chances are you've already got applications running in your environment that you might not have visibility into. So for us, when we speak to customers about these things, because application governance is a thing now, because it sits with the identity team. It's no longer the developers, right? It's no longer the things that they worry about. You know, we've got a couple of things that we normally do from a best practices perspective. Now, before I jump into those best practices, I want to take you through more fancy slides that Nick really likes, right? So this is a massive bold slide. It's very, very awesome. You know, we love these sorts of slides. And this is out of the Microsoft Cybersecurity Reference Architecture when they talk about security operations. And because security operations is the function of a security operations center analyst, they spend a lot of time looking at signals and doing threat hunting, right, Nick? Writing KQL.
Who doesn't like a bit of KQL in the morning? You'll notice, though, that I just want to point out, Al, I noticed there's a lot of tools in the bottom. So if you look at the Defender XDR piece, there's servers, VMs, containers, Azure App Services, network traffic, and I'm demonstrating my adult literacy skills that I've worked so hard for. And by the time we get to Defender for Identity and Defender ID Protection, where are applications? I see some API integration stuffs, but on this slide, I don't see exactly what we're talking about. And we're making a point that even though there's 65 trillion signals per day that Microsoft is looking at, there's still a huge hole. And by the way, this is not surfaced as part of your secure score, which is often a shock horror for customers, for these application registrations that we've been talking about for this entire presentation, Al.
Yeah, they talk about Entra ID protection, ID specifically, right? Not Entra app protection. And I encourage everyone to download the MCRA, aka.ms/MCRA. And look, I love all of those slides, right? And I was looking at it the other day. And this is the only slide in the entire deck that talks about application security. And you'll notice that it still sits inside of the developer team's worry, right? What they need to do is, And DevSecOps, I've worked with a bunch of developers in a previous life. This is what they worried about. They would deploy something like SonarQube that would do code quality management as well as security management, so that there's security baked into the design. And this is an important practice. Secure code, your CI/CD pipeline, that release management that you have is done securely, that the code's secured, and then it gets given to the SRE people to run the business, right? And this is the only slide in the entire MCRA that talks to application security. And we sat back, and we've got a bunch of identity people in our business that, talks to customers about, retiring Active Directory consolidation, and all of those things. And we had the same questions, right, with them. So what is it that you do? And they were like, but we care about identity. The developers need to worry about this. And we say, but if you're managing a tenant, this sits in the identity space. So what are you going to do, right? And that's where we came up with the top 10 things that we normally do when we start talking about best practices for application security posture management.
If I may say,
yes,
that understanding only applications and understanding only identity and delivering an application and building that application securely is like managing to get a frozen ice cream cake to the beach on a hot day and then not knowing what to do next.
I'm going to call it Clarksonisms, right? It's like throwing up on the Pope. He said it in one of his things, but your Clarksonisms are on point, right? But Nick, you've spent a lot of time over the last 2 years in this world, right? Specifically around zero trust and, the reason why zero trust exists. And we've done a whole bunch of zero trust assessments, right? That didn't necessarily focus on the application space. In your opinion, if we followed this guide, right? I mean, starting with application inventory, you got to know what you have. I mean, you've seen customers come on and ask you, what do I have, right?
Well, how many? I think of a customer that we spoke to the other day, which is a very, very well-known brand, and we asked them, so you've got all these applications in your estate. Do you have a CMDB? Do you have an application taxonomy? And the basis of anything to do and any type of security actually is inventory, irrespective of your flavor, if it's zero trust or otherwise. So Al, if I don't have an application inventory, and if I don't know what those applications do from a profiling point of view, if it's a web app, how this thing interacts with something else, I actually have got no place of starting to secure my landscape.
And we've been saying this for about 2-3 years now. Everything starts with an assessment, right? You've got to know what you have, even on the data side when it comes to classification. Microsoft Purview, it's Microsoft Purview risk and compliance, right? Not to be confused with unified data catalog stuff. Talks about know your data, right? And in this case, it's the same. Know your applications, and then also understand them, right, from an application profiling perspective. Now, when we move through this, I mean, that's pretty much where you're going to start, is collect inventory, profile these things, and then also start understanding the different deployment models, which we've taken you through. Third-party applications versus custom applications. Why? Because they have different types of security profiles. A public application is seen as a less secure application. There's certain things that you can't do with it that you can do with confidential apps, like certificates and secrets and a whole bunch of other things. Now, Nick, you mentioned earlier on, right, from an application infrastructure perspective, where it's running. You said you had a customer that's running Kubernetes on top of a Windows ecosystem and not a Linux ecosystem. Is there a difference between traditional apps and cloud native apps when it comes to security?
Well, if we consider cloud native, if we want to be pedantic about it, it's basically anything that I can run in a hosted container or in a hosted function, right? Traditional would be my LAMP stack, so Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, or a cloud version of that. So traditional would be that kind of application that I can beat with a stick and reboot a MySQL virtual machine somewhere. And it's got a very different way of, I'm just securing a website, or now I have to secure a backend. Cloud native, we thought we could get away with a whole bunch of stuff and not have to worry about it because of serverless and that kind of thing, until, because of DevOps, we realized that we would have to secure the fabric as well, which was a bit of a shock to the system.
No, it was. Customers started moving to the cloud and they go, oh, you've got firewalls on-prem, right? Cool. What is that? A checkpoint firewall or it's a whatever other firewall? Oh, there's an appliance in the cloud. So if we put everything behind that firewall, we're okay. But hold on, everything has a public endpoint. So you also need to understand how you're securing that either cloud native or traditional application, because that also gets factored into the equation. Web application firewalls, all the rage. Bastion, jump boxes, all of those things, gateways and CASBs for crazy profiling, right? It's important to understand how your, let's call it your soft perimeter, your virtual perimeter is managed and how that works with the application security, because you could have a second layer. Simple thing. You put a WordPress application or you put a WordPress web app behind a WAF. That's great, right? But someone deploys a vulnerability because the dev shop that's doing a pull request of this application into your pipeline, there's a security breach, right? Right? True story. It's going to end up in production and your WAF is not going to care about it because it's some weird SQL injection exploit in WordPress. And it's manifesting inside of a web app and your WAF is going, I'm cool, right? Port in, port out, firewall rule thing, right? So understand the impact of appliances, security appliances in your organization when you start looking at application security posture management. The last four, right? Now, on the left-hand side, you've got frameworks and zero trust. It's really important for you to understand that you don't start from zero. And you've seen that other slide around CIS. And also, if you're not going to comply to frameworks, at least look at zero trust, right? We built the zero trust adoption framework with Microsoft sometime last year, but understand the tenets of zero trust, assume breach, least privilege, and a few others. Nick, do you want to talk to account access and lockdown?
I would. So if we have an application, that application has an identity, and that identity needs to be managed. And that could be any one of these three, not to be confused with managed identities, Al, because there's all of those out there as well. But once you've got an identity out there for an application, and bear in mind that this could be a robot, like an RPA type of thing, it could be a workflow type of thing. All of these things create identities, and those identities can access things, and each one of those identities can do things. Now, if we don't understand what they do, then we are at the mercy of what that application can potentially do. And in a previous webinar, we talked about how you can be exposed by having applications with no owners. And therefore, those applications or compromising that application means you can do anything that application can do. So if we talk about lockdown, we need to profile what an application can do. In the previous steps, you saw that we want to inventory, we want to understand what the app does. And then if we apply the frameworks, and if you don't have a framework, you at least want to apply the principles of zero trust, you risk profile and security profile that application. And then you create a mitigation based on the understanding of what that app can and can't do and how you can secure it.
It is important to make sure that profile plus risk is going to equal mitigation, because ultimately you want to mitigate your risk, right? Data loss, data leaks. We've seen data breaches, the numbers, $2.9 billion just on business email compromise. Compromise, yeah.
Compromise.
All right, so we've taken,
I just want to add one more thing. So the traditional point of securing something is literally just to put a fence around it, be that virtually or physically. However, a modern approach to security is to understand what your risk is and then to secure against that risk, or quite literally to secure that risk. So if Al talks about data as an example, he doesn't guard all data equally. And if we talk about applications and application identities, we want to understand what our exposure is, and then we want to secure against that exposure. And we are going to talk about that very way of securing ourselves versus just buying the same security that the Joneses have and digging moats and buying guns just to secure ourselves in the next few slides.
So we now have given you some way of working through methodically what you need to do when looking at your application security posture inside of your organization.